Getting Away with Murder, The True Story of the Emmett Till Case, Chapter 1, The Boy Who Triggered the Civil Rights Movement. In August 1955, a group of white men murdered a 14-year-old black boy in the Mississippi Delta. News of the murder and the trial that followed it outraged black and sympathetic white Americans across the nation. And reaction to the famous murder case played an important role as a catalyst for the Civil Rights Movement. This is a true account of the people and events connected to the murder of Emmett Till. Sunday, August 28, 1955, a few miles outside of Money, Mississippi. It was after 2 a.m. when the killer's car, its headlights off, coasted to a stop on the gravel road about 55 feet from the darkened sharecropper's house. When the engine shut down, the steady thrum of locusts resumed, filling the humid night air with a pulsing buzz. Shadows from the persimmon and cedar trees in the yard cloaked two white men as they emerged from the sedan and spoke to a man and a woman in the back seat. When they finished their brief conversation, Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Milliam walked boldly toward the house with vengeance on their minds. Milliam, the bigger of the two, carried a long flashlight in one hand and an Army-issue .45 pistol in the other. The brothers walked through the screened front porch of the Cottonfield house and stopped at the door ready for action. Bryant pounded on the door. The house remained silent. He pounded again and shouted, "Preacher, preacher, get up and open this door." Someone moved inside the darkened house, and soon a voice called out, "Who's that?" "This is Mr. Bryant, preacher, from Money." "All right, sir." The door slowly swung open, and a thin African-American man, 64-year-old Mose Preacher Wright, stepped out onto the porch. Milliam shined the flashlight into Wright's face and pointed his gun at the old man. "You got two boys from Chicago here?" "Yes, sir," He nodded back into the house. "They're sleeping." Milliam stepped closer. "I want the one who done the talking and Money. Is he here?" "Yes, sir." The old man's voice trembled. Bryant nodded. "Well, then, we need to talk to him." With the flashlight casting eerie shadows through the dark house, Wright led the two white men to a back bedroom where 14-year-old Emmett Bobo Till slept with three of his cousins. Bryant shook Emmett Till awake when Milliam shined the flashlight in the boy's eyes. When he awoke, Milliam asked, "Are you the boy who did the talking?" Yeah," replied Emmett. "Don't say yeah to me," snarled Milliam. "I'll blow your head off. Now get up and get your clothes on." Emmett sat up on the bed and began dressing while his great-uncle Mose pleaded for him. "He doesn't have good sense because he was raised up in Chicago. The boy didn't know what he was doing. Don't take him." By now the commotion had brought Emmett's great-aunt Elizabeth Wright into the room, and she begged the white men to leave Emmett alone. "Listen, we'll pay you whatever you want to charge. We'll pay you if you release him." "You'd best get yourself back in that bed of yours, girl," snapped Milliam. "Do it now. I want to hear those springs." With tears in her eyes, Elizabeth Wright left the room. Emmett continued to dress, oblivious to the danger that was unfolding around him. He reached for his socks and Milliam stopped him. "Just the shoes, boy. We got to hurry." "I don't wear shoes without socks," said Emmett. His kidnappers cursed him for making them wait while he pulled on his socks and then a pair of canvas shoes with thick crepe soles. When the boy was dressed, Milliam and Bryant pushed him through the house and out to the porch. Mose Wright tried one more time to save his nephew. "Just take him out in the yard and whip him, and I'll be satisfied," but the two men ignored his plea. Before they stepped into the yard, Milliam turned and asked Wright if he recognized them. "No, sir, I don't know you." "Good, preacher. How old are you?" 64. "Well, if you decide later that you do know any of us here tonight, you'll never live to be 65. "But where are you taking him?" asked Wright. "Nowhere if he's not the right one." Mose Wright and his wife watched from the front porch while the two men walked Emmett to their car. Bryant forced Emmett close to the back window and asked, "Is this the boy?" "Yes," said the woman from the back seat. Bryant shoved Emmett into the front seat and sat next to him and pulled the door closed. Milliam got behind the wheel, and the car, its lights still off, moved into the dark, taking the boy from Chicago with them. His naked and mutilated body would be found by a fisherman 3 days later in the Tallahatchie River. Stop for part 1 during reading. The kidnapping and murder of Emmett Till and the trial of his killers became one of the biggest news items of 1955. The viewing of his disfigured corpse at Rayner Funeral Home and his funeral at the Roberts Temple of the Church of God in Christ in Chicago attracted more than 10,000 mourners. The grisly open casket photo of Emmett that appeared in Jet magazine horrified and angered hundreds of thousands more. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, Other civil rights organizations and political leaders expressed outrage at the cold-blooded murder of this boy from Chicago. In an interview, Roy Wilkins, executive secretary of the NAACP, labeled the crime a racist act, saying, "It would appear that the state of Mississippi has decided to maintain white supremacy by murdering children." Newspapers across the country, especially those in the northern states, condemned the killing and racist attitudes that led to it. A picture, a huge crowd gathered in front of Robert's Temple at the Church of God in Christ, the site of Emmett Till's funeral. The protests and condemnations from civil rights leaders and Northerners poked an already raw nerve in the South. The white leaders in southern states like Mississippi that enforced Jim Crow laws, regulations that segregated African Americans from whites, were still stinging from the 1954 Supreme Court decision Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, which declared that racially segregated schools were unconstitutional. In May of 1955, the Supreme Court pushed the issue even further when it ordered that integration of schools must proceed with deliberate speed. The two rulings alarmed Southern leaders who feared the government, and Northern agitators planned to destroy the Southern way of life. Comments from a speech given by the police commissioner of Montgomery, Alabama, typified the attitude of many white Southerners regarding forced desegregation of public schools. Since the infamous Supreme Court decision rendered in 1954, we in Montgomery and in the South have been put to a severe test by those who seek to destroy our time-honored customs. Not since Reconstruction have our customs been in such jeopardy. We can, will, and must resist outside forces hell-bent on our destruction. Despite the Supreme Court's intentions, citizens in the South knew that efforts to change the South would be resisted. A prediction by an editor of the Jackson Daily News foreshadowed the violence that would stir up in Mississippi, setting the stage for Emmett Till's murder. Mississippi will not obey the decision. If an effort is made to send Negroes to school with white children, then there will be bloodshed. The stains of that bloodshed will be on the Supreme Court steps. The defensiveness triggered by the desegregation mandate prompted many white Southerners to take offense at the widespread criticism in the media regarding Emmett's murder. Angry editorials like the one published in the September 2, 1955 issue of the Greenwood Commonwealth appeared in newspapers in Mississippi and across the South, complaining that Southerners were being unfairly criticized for the isolated actions of two men. Even the governor of Mississippi, Hugh White, reacted in the press. Mississippi deplores such conduct on the part of its citizens and certainly cannot condone it. This is not a lynching. It is a straight-out murder. By claiming that Emmett's death was not a lynching, the governor hoped to defend his state from the northern and liberal press that considered the murder a racially motivated crime. The intense media coverage in the weeks between Emmett's death and the trial of his killers focused worldwide attention on the legal proceedings that would be held in a sleepy little town in the Mississippi Delta, exposing to the world the cruel racial intolerance that existed in the South. Enormous changes in the Southern way of life would soon follow. 30 years after a case, a former NAACP official said, "I think that sometimes the hand of God was in the whole thing. White men have been killing black boys down here for years without anyone making such a fuss." The Emmett Till case became a cog in the wheel of change. Perhaps we have television to thank for that. Television and the printed media turned the spotlight in Mississippi. The week-long trial of Milliam and Bryant, held in the county courthouse in the small farming community of Sumner, Mississippi, drew a standing room-only audience every day, with more than 300 spectators, most of them white, packed into the courtroom. Newspapers and magazines from all over the United States sent correspondents to cover the trial. In the early days of television, long before satellite broadcasts, the three major television networks even assigned a camera crew to report the events of the sensational case. Film had to be flown to New York daily. The national and international publicity surprised and angered many local Mississippians, convincing them that they had to defend their Southern way of life from outsiders. One reporter covering the trial explained the reaction of local citizens to the invasion of the media by saying this: "The feeling that the media spotlight was all a plot against the South was the most accepted explanation, and when Roy Bryant and J.W. Milliam ambled into the court in September 1955, they were armed not only with their wives, baby boys, and cigars, but with the challenge of the Delta whites to the interference of the outside world." The trial captured the outside world's interest for several reasons. The Jet magazine photo of Emmett publicized the gruesome details of the murder, making it more than just a Southern lynching. The nature of the crime itself, a 14-year-old boy brutally murdered by two men, made it news, but the reason for the kidnapping and killing, a white woman claimed that Emmett had whistled at her and made ugly remarks, turned it into big news. The racial context of the case also contributed to its notoriety. At the time, Medgar Evers and the NAACP were fighting hard to gain equal rights for African Americans in the South, and Emmett's senseless murder seemed to symbolize the plight of African Americans in the region. Finally, the murder indictment against Milliam and Bryant was a landmark event in Mississippi, a state where more than 500 lynchings had occurred since 1880, because, as far as many people knew, it was the first time white men had been indicted for killing a black person. The trial gave many African Americans hope that finally equal rights for all citizens, regardless of race, might be on the way. For entrenched Southern segregationists, the trial confirmed the fears that had begun with the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education ruling. The white-dominated Southern way of life was in jeopardy. Though everyone involved in the trial already knew the guilt of the defendants, the prosecution, led by District Attorney Gerald Chatham, worked diligently to present a strong case. A number of eyewitnesses testified against the killer, Bryant's confession to kidnapping, and Chatham's eloquent closing argument. After deliberating for barely an hour, the all-white jury declared the defendants not guilty. The verdict set off a storm of reactions equal to those before the trial. Segregationists and racists claimed victory for the South. Civil rights activists and Northerners lamented the miscarriage of justice and condemned the acquittal. Both sides agreed on one thing, however. The jury's decision seemed to signal that in the South, Jim Crow laws and racial segregations were not going to go away. Stop for part 2 during reading. But Charles C. Diggs, Jr., a black congressman from Michigan who had attended the trial, saw things differently. The landmark trial, he suggested, could be used as a starting point for further change. The Emmett Till trial is over, but we as Negroes should never forget its meaning. The fact that Milliam and Bryant were acquitted shows us how tremendous a job we face to bring complete democracy to our entire nation. Negroes and other clear-thinking Americans must combine their efforts to press for freedom and equality through both political and legal changes. The aftershocks of the Emmett Till case continued long after the Tallahatchie County jury set Milliam and Bryant free. For many people involved in the civil rights movement, the murder of Emmett Till and the acquittal of his murderers was the last straw. If black boys could be killed by white men with no fear of criminal prosecution, something had to be done, and there was no better time than 1955 for the movement to begin. The murder of Emmett Till and the trial of the two men accused of murdering him, wrote journalist and historian David Halberstam, became the first great media event of the civil rights movement. It was a kind of attention that the struggling civil rights movement desperately needed to generate support. With the emotional outrage for the murder and trial and nation and international media attention, the increased efforts by Americans who were working for equality, the civil rights movement gained the momentum necessary to break free from the social bondage that had enslaved black Americans since before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Merle Evers Williams, whose husband, NAACP field director in Mississippi, Medgar Evers, was killed by an assassin in 1963, recognized the essential role the Emmett Till case played in future events in the South. Her 1967 biography of her husband, she placed the case in its proper historical context. It was the murder of this 14-year-old out-of-state visitor that touched off the worldwide clamor and the cast a glare of a world spotlight on Mississippi's racism. The Till case, in a way, was the story and microcosm of every Negro in Mississippi, for it was the proof that even youth was no defense against the ultimate terror, that lynching was still the final means by which white supremacy would be upheld, that whites could still murder Negroes with impunity, and that upper and middle class white people of the state would uphold such killings, though their police and newspapers and courts of law. It was a proof that Mississippi had no intention of changing its ways, that no Negro's life was really safe, and that the federal government was either powerless as it claimed, or simply unwilling to step in to erase this blot on the nation's reputation for decency and justice. It was the proof, if proof were needed, that there would be no real change in Mississippi until the rest of the country decided that change must then be forced. On December 1st, 1955, less than 4 months after the trial of Emmett Till's murders, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white person on a Montgomery, Alabama city bus, and her arrest